lucky that they're in this room, and they're these teachers, those rooms, they're crappy little chairs, and they are like that. You're lucky they did, and then that's probably. Oh, yeah. Yeah. These are the nice cushy ones that I have. Actually, this building, I've been
We're pretty quiet. We keep to ourselves. My nerves.
and gotten better because both of them really like it.
Good. That's a good thing.
Yes, let's move it. Back when I lived in St. Louis, I used to be one of the test patients for the OT people because I had a TBI. And they worked with me then, and then they asked me to come back because I knew it to be like
Good morning, everyone.
I don't know any.
I want to be respectful of everybody's time and get started on time, so you can be on your way and do all the important things that you have to do today. So I appreciate everyone coming here. I think as we've developed the new college elaborations and the schools have developed their elaborations and we're developing the handbook and we're getting to what some of the expectations are around promotion and tenure. And the language always comes up about evaluating your scholarship and looking at things like metrics. And there's specific language that talks about measuring the impact and the quality of your work. And it just seems like the best thing to do would be to have a conversation about that and just go through this and spend a little bit of time so everybody's on the same page. Because the concern, you kind of have extremes as it relates to these measures. Some people over-rely on them and use them inappropriately, and other people throw them out because they don't work in all situations. And so what I hope we get to today is try to understand what these metrics are, how to use them to demonstrate the quality of your research. And just like everybody is wearing a different shirt in here today, the way in which you use the metrics is going to be different for everybody because you come from different professions, you have different goals with your research. The key thing is to line those up and be able to talk about why you wore the shirt you did today, okay? So I want to talk a little bit about college elaborations language to give you some perspective on how these metrics, measuring these metrics, fit into what you ultimately have to do. So it talks about having to meet or exceed the minimum requirements of both school and college elaborations. The examples that I'm giving here are the college level elaborations. You need to look at the documents that relate to you as well. The college elaborations is the low bar for these things. It says it's a responsibility of the candidate to prepare a dossier that clearly and concisely supports his or her application for tenure and or promotion. This is just like writing a manuscript, right? You're not writing it for yourself, you're writing it for other people. So you want to make sure that you use the dossier to convince the person that you've met or exceeded the requirements, whatever area it would be, teaching or professional activity or service. And a part of the narrative, it says, you need to provide clear and concise definitions of the constructs of each of those areas. Okay? You need to provide the rationales to support these definitions, and then the evidence or artifacts that document performance that's consistent with that. Okay? So, and it's interesting, as the discussions around this have been out in the hallway and amongst individuals, people will talk about the different ways in which they select the medium that they choose to publish in, right? And different professions kind of have different ways of doing this. And that's all fine, right? But the construct that you build has to be able to be supportable by evidence that you provide, right? And evidence is not just saying, here it is, right? That doesn't speak to what the construct is that represents that you've had excellent professional activity. That makes sense, right? It also says that in addition to the quantity of scholarly activity, the quality and impact of the work will also be considered. So the language is specific. It says that you have to provide that evidence, okay? It says quality is reflected by factors such as impact factors, other ratings, depth and breadth, and so on and so forth, okay? So one of the things that I want you to be clear about is reflected by such factors as, okay? Not the only factor, and I don't think that you have met the criteria of demonstrating by quality by reporting just the impact factor. Okay, that in and of itself is not terribly helpful, and we'll get into that a little bit more as we go. So that's an example. It needs to be a rich tapestry of information to help make that case. And then it should be, the quality, impact, and quantity should be defined in school-approved elaborations and be consistent with the professional standards. And I hear that a lot, right? Different professions talk about what excellence is in research in their different areas. And so that needs to make its way into your definition of this construct of what excellence is. Now, some terms that, sometimes these two terms are used interchangeably, and sometimes one is used and not the other. But I think it's valuable to think about both of these constructs, okay? Quality is just the standard of measured against other kinds of things, the degree of excellence, right? Impact is the influence that it has. And as you get into some of the measures that we're going to talk about, you know, some kind of do one or the other, right? Or some combination thereof. That's why it's important when you establish your construct of what quality is to try to be clear on that in terms of what you're trying to communicate with the information that you have, right? One of the terms that's used in the elaborations as it relates to journal articles is that it needs to be in an indexed peer-reviewed journal. And so I want to talk a little bit about what indexing means. And part of the goal with this discussion is not only about preparing your dossier so that you can put your best foot forward, but it's also, I think, helpful to think a priori as you're developing a study, thinking about the outlet that you might use to enhance your opportunity, right, to be able to demonstrate quality and impact, okay? And so indexing, of course, is one of the requirements for these articles. Does that mean that every article that you do shows up in an indexed journal? No. But if you have the minimum number, and some of them are indexed and some of them are not, it would certainly be reasonable for the promotion committee to say that you didn't meet the standard, right? Because the standard talks about indexed peer-reviewed journal articles. So what is an indexed journal? So it meets requirements to be indexed by secondary services, and I'll mention a few of those in a second. It's usually considered a reflection of quality. And I'm going to operationally define that in the context of indexing in just a second. They're usually considered to be of higher quality than unindexed journals, and indexed journals can be found in literature searches. Okay? And this is a really important element of that, because if you're going to try to find some metrics that represent the quality or impact of your research, you have to be able to find those metrics, right? And if it's not indexed, and we don't know when that's cited or other information, it's going to be difficult to make that case. Some examples are Google Scholar, Index Medicus, Web of Knowledge, Scopus. There are a number of indexing services. I want to point out that the language in the elaborations does not say what index that they need to be, okay? So different professions may use different indexes, and these indexes, as we get into the metrics a little bit, you're going to see that they cover different ground. So they have some commonality in the things that they cover, but they cover different ground. So you have options in terms of finding that. So for example, it's not unusual for someone to say, well, this journal is not indexed. And they're talking specifically about Thomson-Reuters data, right? It doesn't show up there, but oftentimes if you go to like Google Scholar or Scopus, it will be indexed in there. So the way that the index where that journal appears is not important. I don't think that's the construct of quality. It's just that it is indexed so that you can get information about the publication. So, John, yeah.
So I think that this can be an anxiety provoking, and sort of revisiting that for myself. Like, oh gosh, what's an index? How do I know if my journals are indexed? What's an index? Is it fair assumption that if I can go to the library and search through the library's list of different searches, that that's an indexed journal? Those are sources of indexes?
Yeah, I mean, any of those are there. And there's at the very end, I'm going to, Gerald Natal is our librarian. He can help you find that, relative to your profession, the kind of indexes, the kind of journals, you can tell him that, and he can help you do those searches. And they're all in different places, right? Because the indexing is done by different companies. But I think it's important too, and this is helpful in decisions that you make a priori, is getting a handle on the journals that you typically publish in and finding out which ones are indexed and which ones aren't indexed ahead of time.
So for social work, and they usually have, if you go to the journal website, it usually says indexed in whatever, because they want to brag that to get you to know how important they are. Is that true of all the other fields or not?
Oh, many journals do that. On their webpage, they list where they're indexed, but not all of them. But you can do that. You can do that search in the various search engines, and like Google Scholar, for example, is pretty broad. So most of what you're looking for is probably indexed in Google Scholar. Scopus tends to be more inclusive. The ISI index is much more exclusive.
A lot of times it's written in the instructions off, it's long for putting together the manuscript and describe.
So indexing, although I said earlier that that's an indication of quality, it's not a very high bar. And in fact, these are examples of some of the criteria that are used to apply for Index Medicus, okay, which is one of the more restrictive ones. This is the stuff they want to know. They want to know if you have an editorial board and they come from, institutions that people know about, right? They want to know if the editor-in-chief has final call on editorial things, right? So they're trying to remove those journals that are predatory, for example. They want a description of the peer review process, right? And if your peer review process is the people who happen to be in the room take a quick look at that and decide on, that's not going to very, very well, but it's not that hard, right, to send things out and get substantive comments back from reviewers that would be available to think. So, and even how it's funded, is it published on acid-free paper? That's an actual question. So and the reason that this is a librarian question, right? So if you buy the journal, it doesn't disintegrate in 5 years for purposes. So, and they want you to have a statement on informed consent and things of that nature. So the standards are not that high for indexing for the most part. When you find a journal that's not indexed, there can be a couple reasons for that. One, maybe it's a new journal, and they're getting their act together before they submit their proposal. But you can do some investigation into that. If a journal's been around for 15 years and it's still not indexed, it'd be important to understand why, right? Call the editor-in-chief and ask why that may be the case. Because we're not the only institution that talks about indexing of the journal articles, and it puts folks at a disadvantage. And I understand you can't control that, but again, thinking proactively, looking at journals that will capture this for you. So I want to talk about research impact from 3 different perspectives. From the journal, and this is the reputation and quality of the journals, the author impact, and then an impact from individual articles. And I think this is part of the tapestry of what you want to include, but it's also helpful for you to think about this a priori as you're considering what you're going to do. So let me start with the journal impact. I'm going to talk about some of the journal impact measures. I'm not going to talk about all of them, okay? And there's new ones coming out all the time, and someone has an algorithm that is an improvement on the one before, and so on and so forth. And there's nothing wrong with those indices. I just didn't want to have you here till 3 in the afternoon just talking about this particular category. I think these are some of the most common ones that you'll see, but this is not an indication that these are the ones that you have to use, okay? But it gives you an example of how they're doing this. The first one is the one that everybody talks about. It's the journal impact factor. And so the impact factor, mathematically, is not terribly complex, okay? It's the total number of articles, the total number of times its articles were cited during the 2 previous years, divided by the total number of citable articles in the journal during those 2 years. So if you look back at 2016 and 15, you look at how many times those articles in that journal were cited in this year, and then you look at the total number, and that's what you get. So really what it tells you is the number of citations per article during that 2-year period is really what the impact factor means. So it is helpful to compare journals in the same field because they're all competing for the same group of authors and the same general information. It does give an idea of the journal's relative importance and reputation. It doesn't reflect an individual article, right? So is it possible to have an article that appears in, I don't know what the highest one is right now, Science or Nature or something like that, that has never been cited in 10 years? Nature is the top one? Yeah. So you could have an article that never gets cited, right? So the journal can be of huge importance, but there can be an article in there that doesn't have much impact. It counts self-citations. This is something that you'll see people talk about. And are you just citing your own work, and that's making up the bulk of that? I'm sorry, not your own work, but the journal. You're citing articles from your journal, or you try to get them to focus on that. And sometimes you'll see that if you review. If you feel the author pushing you towards citing other articles from that journal, they're worried about their impact factor and they're trying to increase it. So it is susceptible to that. Review articles are highly cited. So many of you have journals that may focus on that, and those tend to be highly cited ones. But the context in which you would use that journal would be if you're writing a review paper, not if you're doing an original experiment. That wouldn't be the type of paper that you would do. But, and it also, this is a really important thing, it depends on the size of the field. If it's a small field, you're not going to have as many citations per article than if it's a large field. And if you look in a journal like Nature, why is that impact factor so high? Because there's tens of thousands of scientists that are in the scope of that journal, and hundreds of thousands of articles that are relevant to the area that's covered there. So you're going to have high numbers, right? So it's important to characterize the impact factor in relation to other journals in the same category. And I'm really sorry that this, can you see that any better on your thing? So double fail on that. But so this shows the impact factor in this particular category, which I think is rehabilitation. And I just took one journal, right, out of that, the Journal of Head Trauma Rehab. Oh yeah, it's in the category of rehabilitation. Its impact factor is 3.214. Is that pretty good?
Yeah.
Who knows? It depends on the category, right? So so that's the impact factor, it's 3.2. It's in the top quartile in that category, okay? And it's ranked 6th out of 135 journals. So if you simply state the impact factor, that's not as powerful as providing the other metrics that come with it. So if it's a top quartile journal and it's ranked in the top 10 of over 100, that's pretty good, right? That paints a much clearer picture on the quality of that journal as it relates to being cited.
How did you pull up the quartile, and is that on the left-hand side if we could see that.
Well, 6 out of 135 is in the top 25%. I just did the math on it, yeah. You can, I think Scopus tells you what quartile it's in. I'm not sure that they do, but you can do the math, so.
Right.
So let me flip this a little bit. And this is the one measure I'm talking the most about because it's the one that I think that's most mischaracterized, right? So I want to tell you a story about impact factor value of 2.0. So I was an editor of a journal that was climbing in the impact factor ratings over time, and it reached and exceeded the value of 2.0. And all of a sudden, we started getting all these international submissions to the journal. And we thought, boy, that's kind of strange. Why is that? Well, it turns out many institutions in Asia, in order to get tenure, you have to publish an article in a journal with an impact factor of 2.0 or higher. So they were specifically, submitting their materials to that. Now, that's, in my opinion, is a misuse of the journal impact factor, right? Because it depends on the thing. So what I want to show here, these are Thomson-Reuters data, and these are different categories that might be relevant to our college. And so I did this experiment. I said, what if you had a journal with an impact factor of 2.0? What would that mean in anatomy and morphology? Well, that would rank you 5th out of 21, and it would put you in the top quartile. So that's pretty good, right? But if you looked at healthcare sciences and services, that would be ranked 47th out of 90, and it would put you in the 3rd quartile. Does that communicate a different message to you when you put that into context, right? So just saying what the impact factor is doesn't tell the whole story, right? I guess if you're in healthcare sciences and services, if you left that off, maybe your chances are better, but I think people are going to still ask questions of what does that mean in the context of that. But now, out of fairness, right, if you look across that, in most of the categories, an impact factor of 2.0 is pretty good. It does pretty good. So, what you're looking at here, when I use examples, I'm going to use my own data, simply because then nobody can complain that I mischaracterized their data or made up stuff. I can yell at myself if I don't like the way I discuss that, and I'll make some critical comments. So I plotted impact factor of the journal versus citations since 2010. And if you look at that, it's a scatter plot, right? The correlation is 0.19. It's not significant, right? And so what that means is, if you look at this, you can see there are high impact journals that had fewer citations, and some lower impact journals that had a lot of citations. So what does that mean? Well, I would interpret that to say that the journal impact factor isn't the only factor that would be helpful to characterize the quality or the impact of your publication. And in fact, if you look at the area in yellow, are those papers that were cited 100 times or more? Look at the impact factor range, right? So, this paper happens to be an example of a paper that the big journals thought was all wrong. They thought it was wrong. They didn't like the concept and couldn't get this paper published in a higher impact journal. A lower impact journal published it, and it got cited like crazy. And I want to point out, it's not being cited because it's wrong, because that can happen too, right? It's now more accepted, but sometimes the higher impact journals are a little leery about publishing something that might be a little different than, in terms of how it lines up with what they're expecting to see. So, impact factor is a measure. It's not the definitive measure, and it needs to be put into context. Not only with the other metrics around the journal impact factor, like the quartile or the rank in that particular category, but we're going to talk about some other indices too. These need to be put together. That's going to be the mantra as I go through here, right? Multiple measures of quality to make your case. Yeah.
Is there a correlation between acceptance rates as a percent and impact factor of journals?
I don't know. Yeah.
So when putting down an impact factor on our dossier going forward, do you put the impact factor of the journal that date when you're working on that, or when the article is published? I mean, what time point, since they constantly change?
Yeah, the correct way to do that is to put the impact factor of the year that your paper was published. And that, by the way, that's why that plot took forever to put together, because I had to line up the impact factor with the year of the article. But that's the right way to do it, yeah. So other measures have emerged as well that talk about the quality of journals. One is the eigenfactor, and this is the calculation of the number of articles from the journal published in the past 5 years that have been cited in the JCR year. So if we wanted this year, we would do the previous 5 years is the time period that we're looking at. But it also considers journals that have contributed to these that are highly cited journals that influence the network. So if the citations for that journal come from lower impact journals, the measure will be lower. If the citations for that journal come from higher impact journals, then their eigenfactor score will be higher. So it's trying to take into account that not all journals are of the same quality, and they're trying to make a measure to adjust for that. It is a weighted metric, which is an advantage, with different weights for the journals. It excludes self-citations. So journals that like to cite themselves a lot are gonna be ranked lower because self-citations don't count. And it's a larger citation window. And when we talked about some of the author measures, like citations, those are going to be more valuable as time goes on, right? If the publication was 2 months ago, it's probably not going to be cited yet, right? But again, this does use it finally. So it is limited to the journals and the journal citation report. That comes from the Thomson-Reuters data, which is a little bit more exclusive than some of the other databases. And then the journals are assigned to a single category. So if you were to do eigenfactor in the way that I described journal impact factor, the journal is going to be in one category, even though it may fit in different ones. You have to pick one. And so if yours gets picked into a much more competitive journal, it's going to disadvantage that journal a little bit, as opposed to not being in a different one. So the article influence score is based off the eigenfactor score. It determines the average influence of the journal's articles over the first 5 years after publication. So this is looking article by article, but it's a collective score, where X is the 5-year journal article count divided by the 5-year article count from all journals in the whole world, okay? And so this is trying to put, and the mean value is 1.0, right? So if you're 1.0, you're average, and if you're below that, you're below average, and if you're above 1, you're above average. That was the intent with this particular measure. It has the same advantages and disadvantages of the eigenfactor score because it's based on the eigenfactor score.
So is this calculated by someone? I mean, how do you find the article, or do we do this ourselves?
Oh, no, you couldn't do it by yourself.
Okay.
The math behind that is really complex. So you would go to eigenfactor.org or something like that, and they can compute that score for you. You can get it. I think my next one is a screenshot of that. So if you go to eigenfactor.org, you can look at these different journals. And so on this one, I'm just trying to show you, this is the category of sport science. And these are the top 5 journals, and those are the bottom 5 journals. And this is showing the percentile for the eigenfactor score and the article influence score. And you can see between the top 5 and the bottom 5, there's a lot of difference between those. And if you look at like the article influence score, remember I told you 1.0 is the average. These ones are between 1.6, 1.2, in that range. So for all journals that there are indexed, those journals are a little bit above average. These journals, their score is less than 0.1, so that means they have virtually no influence on science as a whole. Yeah. Cite score is another one that you can find. It's the total citations in a given year to all documents published in the last 3 years divided by the total number of documents published in the last 3 years. And it's fairly simple. It's based on the Scopus database, which is broader than the Thomson-Reuters database. The problem is it's biased against journals that publish front matter. So front matter is other things other than articles. So if it's a thing in the journal, right? If it's a editorial, if it's a whatever, those count as part of the article count. So if you do that type of thing, it's going to bring your score down than if you just, all you do is publish the articles in and of themselves. But it gives you some indication. Let's say, for example, that the journal that you publish in is not in the Thomson-Reuters database, but it is in the Scopus database. It gives you a metric that it's available. So the Shimago journal rank is the influence of scholarly journals that accounts for both the number of citations received by the journal and the importance or prestige of the journals where such citations come from. So it's similar in that regard to the Eigenfactor score, which was based off the ISI data, right? Now the feature about the Shimago journal rank is that it can be used to compare different disciplines. Remember, the journal impact factor could not, right? This takes into account, it tries to equalize that for you. It's based on the Scopus data set, which is broader, which is an advantage. It is a little more difficult to understand than the impact factor, right? The impact factor is just a simple division thing. And another con is journals in life and health sciences tend to have higher values. So if you're in life or health sciences, you get a little boost. If you're not, you're there. So I want to talk about that feature, right? So when you're using your quality or impact information and you're making your case, it's important to put these into context, right? So if you're in criminal justice, for example, and this may tend to underestimate, that needs to be outlined in your dossier, right? When you're talking about the quality of that of the journal that you may be in there, that's an important thing to say, because the idea in your dossier is to demonstrate that you have quality and impact relative to your discipline, not to the rest of the world, right? So this source normalized impact per paper, or sometimes called a SNP, is the ratio of the journal's citation count per paper and the citation potential in its subject field. So it's like the citations that one had to the citations in all of the journals in that particular area. So it's kind of like your percentage of the business, if you will. It can be used to compare across disciplines, right? Because the denominator is discipline specific, so it just tells you what percentage of your business that you have. So if someone else has a bigger business, right, but you can still tell what percentage of it that they have. It is more difficult to understand than the impact factor. Journals in engineering, computer, and social sciences tend to have higher values. So here's, I took some journals and I looked at the journal impact factor, the Eigenfactor, the article influence, the cite score, the Shimago journal ranking, and the SNP. And I got those measures for each of those journals. And then in parentheses, I put the rank based on that score. So if you look at the journal impact factor, the British Journal of Sports Medicine is the top one in that category. American Journal of Sports Medicine is second, Medicine, Science, Sports, and Exercise third, Journal of Applied Physiology in that order, right? So that's the relative importance of the journals for that factor. If you look at the eigenfactor, okay, and you look at the British Journal of Sports Medicine, which was number 1 for the journal impact factor, now it's number 3 based on the eigenfactor. Does anybody have a quick hypothesis as to why they go down in rankings when you use the eigenfactor as opposed to the journal impact factor?
Self-citation.
Self-citations. They like to cite themselves, okay? So, this is an opportunity to take that into account. If you look at article influence, site score and so forth, it's, they don't vary wildly, right? So the top 1 or 2 tends to be 1 or 2 in most of those, and the bottom 2 tend to be the bottom 2 in most of those things. But this provides a tapestry of where that journal sits. And I'm not saying you should use this chart, but it does at least help put into perspective where these journals are. And you may think about these measurements in terms of the selection of the journal where you may wish to submit your work as well. Those are not the only factors that are important as it relates to the quality of the journal. We still have the old-fashioned acceptance and rejection rates, which gives you some perspective, but those need to be put into context too, right? Because if a journal, for example, has an acceptance rate of 100%, does that mean it's a lousy journal?
Free screen?
Yeah, I mean, they may solicit articles. So there are, and those journals tend to do like review articles, so they pick the people that they want to write these articles, right? They tend to be high impact articles too, and they tend to be actually pretty good. But that factor alone isn't going to be helpful because it makes it look like they're pretty lousy. But you need to understand the reason that they do that. Editorial board qualifications, and I don't think that the intent with that is to say, hey, they have someone from University of Toledo, that's more prestigious than Bowling Green. I don't think that's the intent, but if it's like, this has people from universities that have actual programs in this, versus this is a random person who has a private business in a Caribbean island, and that's who the editorial board is, right? That's the kind of the context, I think, for that. Journals affiliated or sponsored by an established scholarly or academic institution. This one comes up all the time. So people will say, this is the flagship journal for our profession. Okay? Now, the only part of that I would take exception to is you need to operationally define flagship and what the thing is that. But the fact of the matter is it's not unusual at all to have journals that are associated with your professional organizations, and those are widely read. And so, that can make sense for the kind of work that you do, right? That's the audience for your work. That's the journal that you have. That becomes an important factor to consider. Now, all things being equal, right? If you have one that has stronger metrics on the traditional metrics, and the other one may be unindexed, and that would create some challenges in and of itself, right? But and you have some choices. You have to weigh and consider what the strength of your argument is going to be relative to this for the journals that you select, right? Another is subscribing libraries. This is a factor actually used a lot in business, and what that is, WorldCat is an index of the number of libraries that these publications appear in. So, and it's worldwide. So, if you look up your journal, it'll say, this journal is subscribed to at 5,000 libraries across the world, right? And then another journal may be subscribed to by 4. And so it gives you some indication, at least, we have to give the librarians some credit that, they're making some choices in the journals that they subscribe to, and if they tend not to in some, in the others, right? I wouldn't use this as an exclusive criteria, but it is a criteria that you can use relative to the journals. If you get in a spot where it's hard to find metrics around that, this is one that you might want to seriously consider and look into, even in priority. So all we've talked about thus far are indicators of the quality or impact of journals, right? This doesn't say anything about your work, right? It just talks about the reputation of the journal that you are submitting your work to or getting your work published in. These measurements are about author impact. And these aren't all of the measures, and there's always new ones that are coming out. But these are some of the more common ones that you see, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about those. I'm going to use my own metrics for the purposes of this discussion, and I don't want that to be misconstrued as that is the expectation. I've been a full professor since 1997, so that's a little bit, I've had a little more time to do some of these things, so as you look at these metrics, I don't want you to think that's what you need, okay? I just use my own because no one can yell at me but me to do those. Plus, if there are questions about how those measurements, I can answer them because I have some knowledge of my own work. So citations. This is just the number of times that your work has been cited. Very simple, right? Now, in order to get this measure, the journals have to be indexed. Because if they're not indexed, you won't be able to get a measure of citations. And so here's an example of different measures. So Google Scholar has 7550. If you look at Web of Science, it's 3072. That's a lot of difference. Why do you think that's different? It's this, you know, my work is my work, right? That indexes more stuff. You know, Google Scholar includes things like books. So, you know, if your work gets cited in the textbook, it's going to show up in Google Scholar, but it's not going to show up in Web of Science. Remember, Web of Science was the more exclusive. That's the Thomson-Reuters data. Also, there's ResearchGate. How many of you are on ResearchGate? Not a bad idea, right? It provides this and then some other measures that I'll talk about a little bit later to add to the criteria and then scope. So there's going to be some variability, and my suggestion would be to you know, provide that from multiple perspectives. Again, multiple data points. So the advantages of this, just your author citations, it's pretty simple. It's the number of times your work has been cited. It demonstrates that your work is influencing. So would you agree if the work has been cited 10 times versus 0 times, that's making more of an impact, at least a measurable impact along the way. Now the problem is you can't tell if it's good or bad, right? If people are constantly citing your work as an example of how not to do things, or poor quality or design problems or things of that nature, it could get cited actually quite a lot, which would not be a good thing for you. And of course it does vary by tool. The other thing, and I should have included this as a comment, is that this is influenced by the time that's elapsed since the publication has been published. So if the paper came out last month, it's probably not going to have any citations. If it does, it's going to be small, right? So it's going to be hard to tell the influence early on. So it takes a little bit of time. And so it's important, though, to contextualize that, right? If your work is relatively recent and you're talking about citations, talk about that, right? Because some of the articles, maybe you did one that would have been 5 years old by the time you submit your materials, and another one is a month old, right? You would expect a few more for the ones that's been out a little bit longer, right?
So one of the things that would go into that would be the lead time for the RF journals. So from the moment you submit to the moment it actually officially comes out. And is that widely variable in different professions too? I mean, we have journals that you're lucky if it's 2 years later and it already comes out.
Yeah. I think the language, I think the language when you're coming up is that if it's been accepted for publication, it counts.
I'm talking about for the citation
Oh,
rate
well,
though.
if it isn't out yet, it may not. Although some journals have a pre-publication version that'll have a DOI on it, and it actually gets cited before it even gets published, technically. but that context is important to articulate, right?
Right, I mean, I'm thinking about if I see something today, it just popped up on the web last night, I finally see it today, I'm about to submit an article, I'm like, oh, this is perfect, I'm adding it. Then, the time between that moment I submit and the moment it comes out, assuming they love it, it will be that amount of time before this thing can possibly have my citation attached.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And so I didn't know if like 2 years is ridiculous or if everybody is like that. That's kind of what I was asking.
Yeah, I think it's all, it's a good mix of all that type of stuff, but that's important context. And so, that's gonna be a recurring theme, right? If that's the context and it's gonna be a couple years before it cites, that's exactly right. It's gonna be a while before people begin to find that article and they begin to cite it. You're just not gonna have that many citations unless you do something wildly impactful in the first few years. That's true for everybody. I mean, I have papers from last year that haven't been cited yet. I know it's coming, but.
Do any of these metrics or these approaches take into account the order of authorships? Or is it just if you're in there?
Just if you're in there, yep. Yep. That's any of the author-related indices doesn't differentiate where you are in that order. It's just stuff. But that's something that you do need to talk about in your dossier, right? Is the contribution that you made to the articles that you're on. But that wouldn't be reflected. Yeah. Okay. The second biggie, right? This is the one that, when people talk about journal, they talk about the journal impact factor. When they talk about author impact, they talk about the H-index. So let's talk about the H-index. The H-index is computed, right, by taking all of your articles and listing them in reverse order in terms of the number of citations. So the most cited one first, the second most cited one second, and so forth. So you make that list. You go to the first one, and you look at the number of citations, and if it's greater than 1, you move to number 2. If the number of citations for number 2 is more than 2, then you move to 3, right? So let's say then I get to the 5th one, and that's been cited 4 times. So it doesn't meet the criteria for 5, so you go back to the one where it met it, so you'd have an H-index of 4. So what that means is you have 4 articles that have been cited 4 or more times. If your H-index is 32, that means you have 32 articles that have been cited 32 or more times. That's what that index means. So, is that a measure of author impact? Yeah. Is it perfect? Does it tell the whole story? No, right? So you have to put that into context, right? Because is your H-index going to be influenced by the size of your field? Right, because people have to cite you. So if you have a very small field and there's not a lot of total citations in it, then you may have a relatively smaller H-index than not. So they actually use this measure. Has anybody done the evaluations for the Distinguished University Professors? Nobody? So this is a measure they look at when they evaluate the, does everybody even know what Distinguished University Professor is here? No? It's like a lifetime appointment and you get to be called Distinguished University Professor.
That's all it does for you?
There's money associated to it.
Okay, that's different.
Is there money associated with it?
Yeah, you get money every year for 5 years, I think.
Oh.
For 5 years? Yeah, so it's like super professor, right? But they look at the H-index as one of those. And if you look at those, it depends on the profession that they come from, right? Because if you do artistic work, for example, you're not going to have an H-index. But the people who are involved in areas where they publish peer-reviewed articles, you're not going to find anyone with an H-index below about 15. Right?
So again, is this something that we self-calculate, or is there somebody in the world that does?
There's somebody in the world that does that for you. So if you go to the library website that has the database, if you go to Web of Science, for example, and you can when you do a search on you as an author, it'll list all your papers, and then there's a little thing that says do a citation analysis, and it'll give you this. It'll give you the total number of times you've been cited. You know, it'll give you a number of metrics. If you do, how many of you have an account in Google Scholar? That when you bring up your profile, it'll tell you what your H-index is when you do that. Same with ResearchGate. If you look at scores, I think it's called, it'll give you what their computation of your H-index is. So I want to point this out again. There's a difference, a huge difference between the Web of Science and the Google Scholar impact factor. Why is that?
What the indices is?
Well, this index is more stuff, right? So the H-index would be influenced, for example, by citations in textbooks, right? This one would not. And so the intention of your research, again, reporting multiple things can give you perspective and identify, the kind of impact that your research is having. Sometimes your impact is more clinical or more practical, and sometimes it's more the next step in science, right? So you may, if you're the former, you might do a little bit better here, right? If it's the latter, those might be closer, for example. So it's helpful for benchmarking faculty at similar stages of their career. It captures productivity and impact. It does not compare across disciplines for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. It does not consider context or your career. It doesn't consider author placement. Okay? And of course, it's different by tool. The other thing is that in early career faculty, it's usually not a very high score. I mean, if you have 5 papers and the last 2 were out within less than a year, you really only have like 3 is probably the best you're going to have, right? This might be a little bit more enlightening for someone going up for full professor, for example. But I would still report these metrics, regardless. So the G-index is given a set of articles ranked in decreasing order of the number of citations they receive. The G-index is the unique largest number such that the top G articles receive together at least G-squared citations. Okay, I know, right? It's not terribly intuitive. So if you take, let's say you take the first 5 articles and you sum all of the citations for those and you square those, then that number should be the square of the ranking of that particular thing. So why did we do this one? Well, someone was trying to improve on the H-index, and what it actually does is sometimes when you have an H-index, your first article could be cited 150 times. Your second one could be 4, your second one, or your third one could be 2. You'd have an H-index of 2, but you'd have way more than 100 citations of your work. So the thought is that the H-index would underrepresent the total impact that your work has had, although a lot of it came from one article. So if you square that, it gets you a little bit further down the list before you hit the number that you would get. It's not as widely known, but it's there. And as you think about a metric, it may be that you have one article that's really impactful. You may want to get that measurement to complement the H, just to put things in context. The I-10 index is another one. So the I-10 index is simply this. It's how many papers do you have with 10 or more citations? Pretty simple, right? And so in this case, it would be 130. This comes from the Scopus database. You could actually compute that on your own with the ISI data set. So the algorithm is like this. You put them in reverse order, and you keep going down the list until you find an article that has been cited less than 10 times, and you go to that number. So if you have your 130th article, right, has 10, then it would count. If the next one has less than 10, it would be that number. That make sense? It's just simply the number of papers with 10 or more citations. It's simple and straightforward, and it's only from the Google Scholar set of data in this particular case. ResearchGate's another tool that's out there, and a number of you said that you were on it. There are some things about this that I think are helpful, at least, especially for earlier career scholars, because it certainly includes some of those other things. It'll give you an H-index, and it'll give you total number of citations and so forth. But it also gives you reads, profile views, and some other things, other measures where you can demonstrate that people are becoming interested in your work. That may not have manifested itself into a citation yet, but people are paying attention to what you're doing. And so, this is what it looks like on your page. You've probably seen that. It gives you this RG score, which is about the impact. I don't answer questions or do any of that stuff, so I've disadvantaged myself, I guess, with my score. But it's based on the interest in your publications. And then it tells you where you are relative to other ResearchGate members. And is that a very helpful measurement?
Not really.
So that's against everybody in physics, in whatever. So it's really not good. If it's high, you might as well report it. I mean, that can be a valuable thing, but I wouldn't put a lot of stock in that as to where, especially early career.
I have a weak question, but so sometimes women get married and change their names. So how, can you put in the parameters of what you're searching for, or does it mean like, you know what I mean?
You identify your own articles in ResearchGate.
Oh, it's not just by your name, okay, never mind.
Yep. But there are other things that you can do. There are research ID numbers that you can register with the different databases, and then you link it to those. So then whenever you publish, and some of the journals will even ask you like what your ORC ID is or something like that, so that they can specifically link it to you. I think it's important not to overlook other measurements too, and I'm just calling them esteem measures, but you know, if you've been elected a fellow of a learned academy, I think that's some measure of your individual influence on your field, and should be mentioned. If you've gotten a competitive research fellowship, for example, or you're editor or reviewer of a major journal, you know, major journals don't ask people to review that they don't know anything about or don't have any confidence in, right? So if you're asked to be a reviewer, that's a big deal. And I think that should be included as well. If your research has received any awards, I would certainly mention that. That's not a number, but I think it's helpful in that tapestry. If you're asked to be on a grant panel, I think that's helpful. And there are a lot of others. I just gave some examples. But those should be in there too. So quantitative and qualitative information.
So some of those examples are things that I've actually put into my professional service. Should, you know, so for example, being on the editorial board of a journal, being an external reviewer of grants, those types of things.
Yep.
Should I reconceptualize that as kind of other professional activity and have it in the professional activity section?
I think it's okay to mention that in both places. So in this place, you're not saying that you did service. You're saying this is an indicator of your reputation in your field. And you wouldn't say, you know, I served on it for so many years or whatever, but you would in the service area. So this is just providing additional evidence that you have a developed or emerging reputation within your field for research.
And with reviewing abstracts for conference, then
Sure, yeah. Anything, I mean, if you're invited to do something where they're asking for your scholarly evaluation of something, I think that's an indicator, right? But those measures are just like any other, right? If the only evidence that you have that you've had an impact is that you reviewed abstracts for a state conference, that might not be the strongest total picture of evidence. Article impact is another way to look at this. So you know, we talked about the journal and the reputation of the journal, and of course the downside of that is that doesn't say anything about you or your paper. The author